I just thought by looking at you, you looked like everybody was peachy, and so that's good to hear. Anything that we need to announce before we get going tonight? Okay, I can announce that then. All right, well, let's bow for prayer. Our Father in God, we are thankful for this opportunity to be here tonight. And we know, Lord, that there are a lot of people going through a lot of difficult things, even around us and in other places. We're just asking for your care and your protection over those that are struggling in different ways. Sometimes the things that we see in other people's lives, but other times we don't see, and they're just carrying a burden. We're asking you to lift that, and if it's something that we can do, that you'll help us to do it as well. We're thankful for the opportunity to be here tonight and ask you to guide us in our study. Help us to open our eyes to see the wonderful things that you have in store for us in your word and to be benefited by our time together. In Jesus' name we're praying. Amen. Who was going to give me $5,000? No, no, that was not the question. No, I just asked if there were any announcements that needed to be made. Yes, sir. By the way, anybody want to give me 5,000? Just dawned on me. Yeah, okay. I picked up one of those too in the parking lot the other day. So $1 million bill. Uh, it had Benjamin Franklin on it, of all people. Uh, okay, so we're going to talk some more about parables tonight. Appreciate you being here with us, and we've tried to look at a number of things regarding the parables. And the first and most important rule that I've tried to suggest to you again and again and again is the rule of context. So, what is the rule of context? Context rules. Okay, so that's, if you get that, then you get an A for the class. Okay, so um, I guess I got to put my tongue just right down outside. Or hey, Andrew, this is not working. It is on. I actually even turned it on this time. Take it and try. Let's see. Voila! Look at that. Whoa. Okay. All right. We're going to start out talking about the Good Samaritan tonight. Probably the most well known of all of the parables. People who don't know anything about the Bible, in fact, have heard of the Good Samaritan, or they've heard something about the Good Samaritan, or they use the terminology about being a Good Samaritan, and maybe don't know really the whole occasion. So we're going to start out, first of all, by reading the parable in Luke chapter 10, verses 30 to 35. Then Jesus answered and said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a certain priest came down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion. And he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Verse 35, on the next day when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you. Okay, so pretty straightforward, right? As far as the story is concerned, you have a man who gets hurt or abused or taken advantage of. He's he's left on the side of the road to die. He's left there half dead. And it says that a priest comes along the way on his way from Jerusalem back to Jericho. Now remember, these are stories, okay? These are stories that are going to illustrate something. But you would think of a priest who's been in Jerusalem and he's now going back to Jericho. What was he in Jerusalem to do? To worship. Okay, I mean, that's the natural feeling or thought that we would have from this. The Levite, same way, he's on his way back home or back away from Jerusalem, suggesting he had gone there to worship as well. So you would think that the story would say, and so when the priest saw him, what did the priest do? You would think the priest did what? Stopped, took care of him, helped him out, provided for him whatever he would need. You would think the same of a Levite. Okay? So the Levite, of course, is the family from which the priest came. And not everybody was a priest who was a Levite, but you had to be a Levite to be a priest. So he comes out of the priestly family as a Levite. And here he is now. He walks along. What does he do? No, well, he at least stops and looks at him. The Levite does. Yeah, the Levite stops and looks, it says, and then passes on the other side and just keeps on going. Okay? And then the Samaritan, which in that culture, when he uses the term Samaritan, what does he expect out of the people to think or to feel when he says that? Yeah, disgust. I mean, the Samaritan comes along and kicks him while he's down, right? I mean, that's kind of what you would expect the story to say. The priest would have helped him, the Levite would have helped him, the Samaritan would have come along and kicked him and did whatever, just because how they thought of Samaritan. But the Samaritan stops, takes care of him, puts him on his animal, takes him to the inn, helps care for him over the night, and leaves some extra money for the innkeeper and says, hey, look, anything more you do and take care of him, and if there's more even, when I come back through, I'll pay you the rest. Okay? So from a story standpoint, you can see that happening, right? Something like this. Yeah, I mean, this is not unusual. In fact, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was fraught with a lot of problems. There were thieves on this road constantly. People were being taken advantage of. So telling the story would have made all the sense in the world, except for the twist that there's a Samaritan who does this good deed. Now, so let's look at the context. We said that context rules. So if we go back earlier in the chapter 16 of the, chapter 10 of the book, the first 16 verses is where Jesus sends out the 36 pairs, the 72. They go out, and what do the 72 go out to do? What are they sent out to do? To share the good news, to preach, to do good deeds, they're to go out and help this. And so they go out verses 1 through 16. Then verses 17 through 24, the 72 return. And what do when they tell Jesus? Well, I mean, what's their news? It's great news. Yeah, they're excited. They share this great news with Jesus about how successful they were, what they were able to do, what they saw, how this happened, so on and so forth. And then look at chapter 10. And we're going to drop down to verse 25. Chapter 10 and verse 25. It says, and behold, a lawyer stood up. Sorry, Guy. The lawyer's not going to be in good light here. Okay. Guy is really a good guy, though. Okay. So you don't have to worry about Guy. Okay. So verse 25. And behold, a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said unto him, what is written in the law? How do you read? And he answered him and said, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength, and with all of your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So what kind of an answer? Will you give a good answer or bad answer, the lawyer? That's a great answer, okay? I mean, it's not only just a clever answer, it's a right answer. I mean, it's the right answer. But what should you do? Well, you should love God with every fiber of your being, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus then says to him at verse 28, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. Okay, so he gives him an attaboy. You did the right, you said the right thing, you gave the right answer, everything is exactly accurate. Then it says, but wanting to justify himself, he said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Okay, so remember the story that Jesus tells of the Good Samaritan is about what? Somebody needed help, okay? Being neighborly or showing a kind heart or a neighborliness or love or whatever you want to say, compassion to somebody. Uh, so then Jesus tells the story, okay? And then at the end of the story afterwards, I mean, the picture changes. So what happens after he goes to Mary and Martha's house and he eats with them? That doesn't seem to have a bearing specifically on the parable. So Jesus replies to him, to the question of the lawyer, so who is my neighbor? Okay. So if we look at the parable itself, who's the neighbor? Is it the guy who gets hurt and is left on the side of the road? Or is it the Jew, or the priest, or is it the Levite, or is it the Samaritan? Or is the answer yes? Okay. Uh, right. Right. That's exactly right. Can't name him or can't call him in that sense. It's just, I mean, I used to do that with our children occasionally. Melissa, your son is doing thus and so. So, you know, I did not want to identify that he was my son at the moment. Your son has done. But there is this separation, you're right, that he is making. The one who showed mercy, I guess, he's the one, right? And I mean, it's almost like I don't want that to be the answer, but I guess he's the one. I guess he's the one. But really, is Jesus answering the question, who is my neighbor? Or is he addressing what I think he is addressing, what it says in the beginning of the verse, where it says, this man wanted to justify himself. Okay? He tries to trap Jesus in a question. First of all, Jesus turns it back on him. He answers correctly. But then it says, remember, look at verse 29, but wanting to justify himself, this lawyer says, okay, so who is my neighbor? And I think that Jesus is more addressing the idea of I mean, he does address the subject of neighborliness. Don't get me wrong. But I think it's as much as anything else, he's addressing this man who wants to justify himself. And then to tie into what Kim said, he doesn't want to think that a Samaritan could do something good. And so he kind of tries to distance himself almost from that as well. Um, so, what is the parable illustrating for us? Okay. So, let me tell you what Augustine said. Okay. If you're familiar with Augustine, one of the early church fathers, in fact, today is Augustine's birthday, by the way, November 13th. He would be 1,670 years old today. Okay. So, he lived back 350 to 430, right around in that area. So Augustine suggested this. This is his explanation of what the parable is illustrating. I want you to tell me what you think about this. All right. So he says, the man who was robbed and beaten is Adam. The robbers are the devil and his angels. The priest and the Levite are the priesthood and the ministry of the Old Testament. The Samaritan is Jesus. The oil is comfort. The wine is an exhortation to work. The inn is the church. The two coins are the commands to love God and love neighbor, and the innkeeper is the Apostle Paul. so that's Augustine's view. Now, you remember I told you that actually back in about the 1700s, turn maybe into the 1800s, that there was a just a gigantic shift in understanding parables and looking at them, and instead of trying to allegorize every element of the parable and say every single thing represents uh, something and identify it this way, that's this way, there was this dramatic shift of thinking that occurred, religiously speaking, that people came to understand and say most parables just illustrate one or two things. That some of this is, and I hate to use the term, but window dressing to tell the story. Okay. Um, some people are offended by it that, well, Jesus wouldn't use window dressing. Well, Jesus could tell a story like we could tell a story. So I think it's a story to illustrate a particular point that he's trying to make here. The key to understanding it, I think, is the man trying to justify himself. So Jesus tells the story of a Samaritan who would be completely out of their thinking and mind that he would do something good and something kind and be this kind of person. So, so I would suggest this. First of all, we learn that even one's enemy, which would the Samaritan would be considered, is a neighbor to one who is in need. I mean, he stops and he shows neighborliness or love to this man who's been beaten up and abused and left on the side of the road. And secondarily, it shows the religious standing, the priest and the Levite. Just because you're religiously oriented, it doesn't give you an excuse to be loveless and not to show neighborly. And I think Jesus illustrates both of these. So here's a man who wants to justify himself that he's okay, everything's fine, I'm good, I don't need to change. And Jesus tells this story that says, even this Samaritan, this dog of a guy over here, is better than you. And so it would have to rattle his cage, shake his world up to see it in that way. So, what do you think of Augustine's explanation? It seems way overblown. It just seems to be way, way, way too much. Okay, somebody else, a lawyer. Yes, sir. Mhm. Okay, right, okay, yeah. I mean, it's a willingness to get our hands dirty, to do what it might need to be done in a situation that maybe is not appealing to me, maybe it's not what I want to do, but I mean, in using the priest and the Levite, you can see they would have the answers, they would be in the right as far as their thinking would be concerned, but there's something you have to do, and you have to be the person that does that. Okay, I thought I saw. Oh, right, right, yeah, and takes somebody who is in that same situation. In fact, she shows her prejudice by saying, "Who are you, a Jew, to talk to me?" I mean, you don't have any dealings with us. Is kind of what she said. Right, another good thought on that. All right, somebody else. Right, right, right. Yeah, I mean, and so whatever justification process they go through to not help out, then that's what he's addressing. Now let's to be to be honest and with all of us, we've all every one of us have seen work and not seen work, right? Seen work and passed up an opportunity to do something. Maybe later you felt badly. I should have said, I should have done, I should have, whatever. Hopefully, then that prompts you the next time you have an opportunity to spring into action. Or when you read something like this, or you begin to understand, I need to be more the kind of person that the Samaritan is, rather than to think, well, I'm okay, I'm good. See, I mean, I've been to Jerusalem to worship. I'm a priest or I'm a Levite, as they might have thought. Dang. Mhm. Okay, yeah, and it doesn't matter who it is that's laying on the side of the road. I mean, if he had said it's a Jewish priest laying on the side of the road, oh, okay. Now I think in this, no, he's just there's a man got beat up, left on, and here he is. So right, intimidating. Okay, right. I mean, he's been stripped, sure, but whether that means it, but anyway, it's a story. But the idea behind it is he has been taken advantage of, beat up, abused, left on the side of the road, and these two guys walk by and they don't do a thing. They don't care at all. They don't. Whether they congratulated themselves that they were a priest and a Levite, I don't know, but that's kind of the implication of the story. Okay, so all right. Anything else? Yes, sir. Steve. Right. Right. And you know, and the point, I mean, of I mean, as you're bringing out here, if it didn't let us know the man was trying to justify himself, and he just said, "Who's my neighbor?" Then it could have been an academic question. Oh, anybody is your neighbor. Anyone who's in need is your neighbor. But Jesus' point is addressing the man who's trying to justify himself that everything's okay. I know all the right answers. I've got it all down pat. Everything's good. And Jesus said, no, you have to do. You've got to go through. You have to follow through on it. All right. Let's see. Yes, ma'am. Well, because they were considered half breeds. I mean, is basically what it was. And so they had sullied or soiled the Jewish line. And so, yeah. And so they were, that's just, same reason today you have racial prejudice, I guess. Of they're this way and they're not like me. I'd like you more if you were more like me. Yeah, yeah. I think it is because of the half breed and just how they felt about them not being pure and what they did in their religion or their faith at all. Right, right. Lineage or their religion. Okay. Yes. but you, but you could have said Linnell walked by because. Okay, But because of the priesthood of all believers, it could be any of us as a priest. Okay. All right. All right. I got to go back into the 4-year-old class. Hold on just a minute. Yes. Right. 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 For us to put it, I guess the best perspective I could think of would be in the immediate weeks post 9/11 to deal with somebody who was Middle Eastern. And to know they were Middle Eastern in this country, there was great anxiety, great fear of anybody, whoever they were. We didn't have to know anything about them, but that was the feeling that many. And it's just like, oh no, oh no. Did you see? He came into the airport. He got on a plane. I was on a plane. Whatever. And that was the thought. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Right. It is exactly that's the case. And I think in that culture in that time it was just completely shocking this story. And you can't justify yourself when you use the lowest of low in his mind to say he did the right thing, he did the good thing. And so I need to be more like him. I need to be more like this Samaritan. Yeah, yeah, you do. And so do I. So okay, let's move on. Uh, so we're going to talk about the two sons. Okay, in Matthew chapter 21, verses 28 to 30. Matthew 21, verses 28 to 30. But what do you think? This is Jesus speaking. A man had two sons, and he came to the first son and came to the first and said, "Son, go to work today in the vineyard." And he answered and said, "I will not." But afterward he regretted it, and he went. Verse 30, then he came to the second, and he said likewise, and he answered and he said, "I will go, sir." But he did not go. Okay, so I had three sons, and all three of mine just said no. so uh, that's right. Your legs aren't broke, Dad. You get out and mow the yard. No, but anyway, the idea of this is okay. That Dad says, "Okay, it's time to go work. Time to go work in the vineyard." And the first one said, "No, I'm not going." Kicks himself, feels bad about it, goes back out, and okay, I need to go work. So he does. Second, Dad, yeah, Dad, I'll do it, and he doesn't do it at all. Doesn't go into the vineyard. So let's look at the context of it. Okay, we go back earlier in the chapter 21, verses 1 to 11. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and then he cleanses the temple, which was obviously very startling in and of itself, in verses 12 to 17, and then the barren fig tree. And then if you look at verses uh, 23, yep, I'm still in Luke here. Let me run over there to Matthew real quick. Matthew 21, verse 23 through 27. And yeah, and he said unto them, whoops, okay, I knew that didn't look right. 21, 23. 20, it's a one after a two makes 21, right? That was in chapter 20. All right, when he entered the temple area, the chief priest and the elders of the people came unto him while he was teaching, and they said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Now, what had he just done? I mean, he made a huge scene in the temple, right? I mean, he's overturning tables. He makes a whip of cords. He drives out the money changers. And finally, they muster up the courage to come to him and say, "Hey, who gave you this authority to do this and to act in this way?" Jesus responded and said unto them, "I will also ask you one question, which if you tell me by what authority, no, let me start that again. I will also ask you one question, which if you tell me, I will also tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John was from what source? From heaven or from men? And so what did they say? We're not going to answer. Yeah, we don't know. Okay, we're not going to answer that question. Why were they afraid to answer the question? Okay. But if they said, well, it came from God, then what would Jesus' response have been? Why didn't you do it? Okay. Why didn't you obey it if it came from God? If they said it came from men, what would their problem be there? They feared. Okay. Feared the crowd. Okay. So we're not going to answer you. We don't know, they said. So he also said unto them, neither am I telling you by what authority I do these things. Now, I would suggest to you that Jesus does answer the question by posing the question to them. I think he's letting them know my authority came from God, and and you wouldn't be questioning me if you understood that or if you accepted that. So that's kind of the setup for the parable then that he tells of these two boys. And then the parable is followed by the parable of the landowner in verses 33 to 44, and then verses 45 and 46 of the same chapter, chapter 21. The chief priests and the Pharisees, they decide they want to kill Jesus. Okay, so the story itself is pretty easy to understand, right? Go work in the vineyard. No, Dad. Okay, I feel bad. I'll go work in the vineyard. Okay, other son. Yes, I will, but he doesn't. So we don't have to wonder though what the explanation of this illustration is. Why not? Because he tells us. Okay? It's again one of the few that Jesus gives us a way to understand how parables work. Look at verse 31. So Jesus says, which of these two did the will of the Father? They said unto him, the first. So Jesus said unto them, truly I say unto you, that the tax collectors and prostitutes will get into the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes did believe him, and you, seeing this, did not even have second thoughts after so as to believe him. So Jesus' answer is what? What is this parable illustrating? Okay, all right. So they just literally turn away from the opportunity as the second son who just says, "No, I'm not gonna go work." Okay, that's certainly his case. What is he, Brian? Okay, okay, yeah. I mean, and of course they're coming to him. Remember, who gave you this authority to do these kind of things? Who do you think you are? What are you doing? So Jesus tells them this story. Now, let me just ask you, but before the explanation, would you have thought? Would you have thought that Jesus was talking about tax collectors and prostitutes? That wouldn't have come to my mind. Okay, I'll just tell you that. I wouldn't have thought that. That's not where I would have gone. So fortunately, Jesus does give us, this is what I'm illustrating by telling us this story. And the other ones are in reality those who are the leaders, the Pharisees, and so on, who claim to be following God, and I want to do what God says, and I'm going to, but in the end, what? They don't do it. Okay? They just walk away and they leave it all behind. All right, somebody else. I saw Drew, your hand up. Right. Absolutely. And I think that's one of the beauties of storytelling or parables, that you emotionally connect with something before you realize, oh, that's talking about me. Okay, great illustration from the Old Testament when Nathan comes to David and tells the parable about the wealthy man who goes and takes the poor man's only lamb, kills the lamb, serves it as food for the guest that he had one night. And David hears that story, and what is David's reaction? That man ought to be killed. Okay, that's what he says. And Nathan says, you're the man. Now, all of a sudden, David's already spoken his own condemnation without even knowing. Now, you go to the king directly and you say, hey, king, you did this and this and this. And the king says, I'm the king. I'll do what I want to do. Okay. Yeah. I mean, but this time he gets emotionally connected, gives his own verdict before he knows he's talking about him. Nathan says, you're the man. You're the one I'm talking about in this story. So you're right. I think Drew's exactly right on this. It would have been a harsh statement to let them know, I'm talking about you. And of course, the Pharisees, a lot of times after hearing Jesus, they walked away and they said, hey, he's talking about us. I mean, they got it. They understood. Okay. They didn't come away like Augustine tried to explain to us what the Good Samaritan was about. How do you know Augustine's explanation is incorrect? How do you know it's incorrect? Well, that wouldn't necessarily, but the reason we know it's incorrect is because when he told that story, they would have had no idea who the Apostle Paul was. It wouldn't have made any sense at all, or the church hadn't been established yet. So to say, well, the inn represents the church and the innkeeper represents the Apostle Paul, they'd have been sitting there going, what in the world? What do you mean? Okay, that's not what they would have come away with. Anytime we study the Bible, it has to, whatever understanding we come away with, it has to make sense to the audience who heard what was being said. Okay? If it doesn't make sense to them, I don't care how you dress it up, that's not right. Okay? When people talk about and read the book of Revelation and they'll say, well, that's talking about this kind of helicopter and this is talking about Mussolini and this is Hitler and so on, that's foolishness to think that somebody who read the book of Revelation in the first century would ever come away with that idea. We're looking at history backward when we do that, rather than looking at lifting ourselves out of history to go back to when it was written and say, what would they have understood when Jesus talked to them or the apostles or whomever? Okay, so so anyway, let's look at this. So what is it? I think it illustrates to us that the kingdom is available to those who actually do what God says, who actually obey God. Okay, the one says I'll go, but he doesn't. The other one says, I didn't want to go, but I'll go. Okay, so that there is availability of reward when we follow God. Yeah. Right. That's right. And we, lest I want to be I want to be careful that I don't paint with too broad a brush, but I would say one of the biggest problems that we are faced with, challenges sometimes, is of being pharisaical, of getting all the rules right and forgetting what's really behind it and what the point of it was. So, huh? Yeah, that's right. I looked in the mirror and found, yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, let's look at the next one really quickly, is the chief seats. Chapter 14, verse 7. So he, Jesus, told a parable to those who were invited, and he noted how they chose the best places, saying to them, when you're invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down at the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And he who invited you and him come and say unto you, give place to this man. And then you begin with shame to take the lower place. But when you're invited, go and sit down at the lowest place so that he who invited you comes to you and says, friend, you go up higher. Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So pretty much we got the understanding what the illustration is about, right? The last verse says, don't exalt yourself, rather humble yourself. It's telling us, But let's look at the context just to make sure we get this. Jesus is eating at the home of a Pharisee when he tells this story. Okay, he's been invited to a Pharisee's home. He's eating with him, and it's on the Sabbath day, and they're challenging to see again whether Jesus will heal on the Sabbath day. Because if he does, oh man, we got him. That's how they felt. Okay, the guests then put him to the test to see whether he will. Jesus refuses to answer them and what they're trying to find out. He then tells the parable itself, and then Jesus teaches further on the subject of humility in verses 12 to 15, and he tells the parable of the Great Supper. So what's going on? Okay, Jesus is invited to the home of a prominent man, and it says, again, go back and look at the first part of this verse, verse 7. So he told the parable of those who were invited when he noted how they were choosing the best places. Okay, so Jesus is at this man's house, and he sees everybody starting to sit down. And in that culture, in that place, remember, we're talking about tables that are about 18 inches high, like an Asian culture today. About 18 inches high. They'd usually be set up a dais type of arrangement. Whoever was the head or whatever would sit here in the center. And then the closer you were to him, the more important you were. Okay, so I'm invited to the party, and I want to get as close as I can. So I sit real close to where the guest of honor, or the one who's actually hosting this. And then somebody better, Richard, came along, and they said, hey, Richard's here, so Jody, you got to go down, because Linnell told the story about the 4-year-old class. And I passed by that guy. Richard was a nice guy and helped him out. So Richard gets to move up, and now I'm embarrassed because I've got to walk in front of everybody else from the chief seat down to one of these lower spots. Okay, I mean, that's what's happening. Jesus said, you're better off to go and sit down in the lowest spot and let the guest of honor come up to you and say, hey, you should be sitting up at a higher spot, okay? And brings you up in front of everybody else. Now, here's the real thing that we don't know. He's eating at the house of a Pharisee. He's watching people jockey for position. But you know what's not told to us is where Jesus was sat or sat himself. Okay? I don't know if they put Jesus at the lowest spot, and that's why he tells this story. I'm confident Jesus didn't sit at the highest spot and tell this story. But his point is, you're better off to humble yourself. In fact, that's what we should be, humble, rather than to exalt ourselves before people. So we're about running out of time here. So the need for humility, I think, seems to be the prominent teaching more than anything else. But I want you to look at, let's see, I'm reading off my notes. Let me look here with you in chapter 14 of Luke, dropping down to verse 12. Now he also went on to say to the one who had invited him, whenever you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor wealthy neighbors. Otherwise, they may also invite you to a meal in return, so that it will be your repayment. But whenever you give a banquet, invite people who are poor, who have disabilities, who are limping, people who are blind. And you'll be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now, when one of those who were reclining at table with him heard this, he said unto him, blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. So, the second part of this, after the story of the don't sit in the higher place, sit in the lower place, now he addresses also a point to the host himself. And what is the point to the host? Yeah, that's right. Don't just invite the high and mighty hoping that you'll get paid back and you're going to get some kind of reward for what you've done. Rather, just show love, really, is what he's telling him. Invite the one with the disability. Invite the one who everybody else would ignore. You invite that person, not expecting I'm going to get something in return. Now, is there a message there for us? Sure, but it'd be the same principle for us. Not only should I humble myself but I also should think of people in a way that I show love to them and practice that same kind of humility with others rather than to think I'm better than him, I'm better than her, and so I'm going to get this and I'll do this so that I get repaid that. Um, it illustrates the need for humility, but it also is a further commentary on not expecting that kind of treatment in return for us. So, some great illustrations that Jesus is using that hopefully we walk away with and say, okay, I get what's going on. You know, there's 30 some parables, 30 some stories. Jesus told a lot of stories, and his stories were to illustrate the points that we've been making. I had somebody one time when I was preaching in Lakeland uh, complained to the elders when I was there, said, I don't think Jody ought to use stories when he gets up and preach. And I said, well, I think Jesus used a lot of stories when he taught and when he preached. Um, Again, stories, I mean, I can just tell you from a speaking standpoint, when you tell a story, people will almost automatically engage with you. Okay. If you're a good storyteller, they'll hang on the story waiting for you to give them the punchline or the finish of the whatever it is, okay, the point of it. So when Jesus told these stories, I can see people just waiting to hear, okay, you mean a priest walked right by him and didn't do anything? Yeah. And then a Levite came, oh, Levite walked right by him and didn't do anything. And then a Samaritan comes by. Oh, okay, I know what a Samaritan's going to do. No, no, you don't. And Jesus tells this story that almost explodes their mind to show them how we need to be and how we need to act. Okay, anything else tonight? You've been very kind. Appreciate you listening. And Steve, I even have what the next four for you if you want to write them down. Okay. We're going to talk about the unfinished tower, the rash attack, the rich fool, and the unjust.